After my grandpa died, my parents sued me over his inheritance. But when I walked in, my name is Hallie Whitmore, and I am 29 years old. When I walked into that courtroom, my parents were already smiling. It wasn't the warm kind of smile that belongs to family, the kind that reaches the eyes and makes you feel safe. It was the other kind, the cold camera-ready kind that was all teeth and no heart. It was the smile my mother, Victoria, used for photographers at charity galas, and the one my father, Charles, wore when closing a deal he knew was ruthless. It was the smile that had always made me feel 6 years old again, small and powerless and wrong, like I was an inconvenience they had to politely tolerate. They were sitting at the plaintiff's table, looking perfect. My father's suit was impeccably tailored, his silver hair catching the sterile light of the courtroom. My mother sat beside him, a portrait of grieving elegance in a black dress that probably cost more than my first car. They looked composed, confident, and righteous. They thought they'd already won. In their minds, the outcome was certain. They were the parents, the rightful heirs who had been wronged by a manipulative daughter. I was the problem to be solved, the obstacle to be removed. They thought I was still that lost little girl they had left behind, the one who would shrink under their sharp gazes and collapse under pressure. They were counting on me to break, but they didn't know I wasn't walking in alone. They couldn't see who was walking in with me. My grandfather, the man they had abandoned and I had loved with every piece of my broken heart, had left me more than a fortune. He had spent 24 years arming me with something far more valuable. He'd left me the truth. And truth, when it walks into a courtroom, doesn't need an introduction. It doesn't need to shout. Its presence is enough to make lies feel suffocatingly small. I walked to the defendant's table and sat down, my own lawyer giving my shoulder a reassuring squeeze. I didn't look at my parents. I didn't need to. I could feel their condescending stares burning into the side of my face. I just focused on my breathing, just like Grandpa Henry taught me. In through the nose, out through the mouth, let the noise fade. Stand still in the storm. The bailiff called the court to order, and the judge entered. He was an older man with a tired face and eyes that had seen too much. He sat down heavily and opened the case file, his gaze scanning the first page. He glanced over at my parents, then at their lawyer. His expression was flat, unreadable. Then his eyes found me. He stopped. The papers in his hand went still. He leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing as he studied my face. Really studied me. A flicker of recognition, of something I couldn't place, crossed his features. The courtroom was so quiet you could hear the soft hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. My parents' smiles were frozen on their faces, their confidence beginning to waver in the face of the judge's unnerving focus. He looked from my face back down to the name on the file, then back to me again. He whispered something, a single sentence so quiet it was almost lost. But in the dead silence of that room, it landed like a thunderclap. Wait, you're her? And that's when my parents' smiles finally cracked. Before I tell you how everything flipped, like and subscribe, and drop a comment to let me know where you are watching from. But the story that brought me to that courtroom didn't start with a lawsuit or a will. It started on a hot, bright, mercilessly clear afternoon in Santa Barbara, on the day I turned 5 years old. It was the day my parents vanished from my life. The day had begun with a strange, heavy silence. Usually, the mornings in Grandpa Henry's sprawling house were filled with sound. The distant chime of a clock, the soft chatter of the housekeeper, Maria, in the kitchen, the rustle of Grandpa's newspaper. But that morning, an unnatural quiet had settled over the estate. It was the kind of quiet that feels loud, the kind that makes you hold your breath without knowing why. I woke up knowing it was my birthday, a fact that should have filled me with a fizzy, childish excitement. Instead, a knot of anxiety was already twisting in my stomach. I padded barefoot out of my room and into the grand hallway. My parents' bedroom door was ajar. I peeked inside. My mother, Victoria, was standing before a full-length mirror, examining her reflection with a critical eye. She was already dressed in a crisp, white linen dress that looked too formal for a regular day. Suitcases, sleek and leather-bound, were open on the bed, half filled with neatly folded clothes. My father, Charles, was on the phone in the corner of the room, his back to me. His voice was a low, tense murmur. "The arrangements are final," I heard him say. "No, there are no other options." He wasn't talking about a birthday party. I crept closer, my small feet silent on the thick Persian rug. "Mommy?" I whispered. She didn't turn around. Her eyes met mine in the mirror. For a fleeting second, I saw something other than her usual polished composure. It looked like guilt or maybe just irritation. Then it was gone, replaced by a bright, brittle smile. "Good morning, birthday girl," she said, her voice sounding like glass. "Go on down to the kitchen. Maria will make you some pancakes. It was a dismissal. I knew it even then. There was no hug, no happy birthday kiss. I retreated, the knot in my stomach tightening. In the kitchen, Maria was humming a sad Spanish tune as she flipped pancakes. She smiled at me, but her eyes were full of pity, and that scared me more than anything. She had placed a single candle in my stack of pancakes, and she sang a quiet, lonely version of Happy Birthday to me. My parents never came downstairs. The hours that followed were a blur of anxious waiting. I sat in the living room with my favorite stuffed bear, watching the front door, convinced they were planning a surprise party. Any minute, they would burst in with balloons and a cake and presents, but the only sounds were the ticking of the clock and the low murmur of their voices from upstairs. Late that afternoon, they finally descended the grand staircase. They were carrying their bags. My father's face was a mask of grim determination. My mother had her large, dark sunglasses on, even though we were inside. The performance began on the gravel driveway, under the punishing glare of the California sun. The heat radiated off the stones, making the air shimmer. My father loaded the last of the bags into the trunk of their dark, gleaming sedan without a word. My mother knelt in front of me, the scent of her expensive perfume sharp and overwhelming. She took my hands in hers. Her touch was cool and dry, her fingers holding mine with a formal, distant pressure. "Be good for Grandpa, okay, sweetheart?" she said, her voice the one she used for strangers. The bright, artificial tone that created a wall between her and the world. The question I had been holding in all day finally spilled out, my voice small and wobbly. "Where are you going?" "Just a short trip," she said, her smile never reaching her eyes. "A little vacation for Mommy and Daddy. We need a break." A break from what? The question formed in my mind, but I couldn't say it. I felt a confusing, terrible shame, as if their need for a break was somehow my fault. "Can I come with you?" I pleaded, my small hands clutching hers. "I'll be really good." For the first time, her perfect facade wavered. A flicker of something, annoyance, regret, crossed her face before it was smoothed away. "Not this time, baby," she said, her voice losing its forced cheerfulness and becoming flat. "This is for grown-ups. You'll have so much more fun here with Grandpa Henry. He has that big yard for you to play in." She was talking about the yard as if it were a substitute for her presence. She squeezed my hands once, a quick final gesture that was more of a release than an embrace. Then she stood up, turning away from me before I could even try to hug her. She walked to the passenger side of the car and got in, closing the door with a soft, definitive click. She never once looked back. My father, who had not said a single word to me, got into the driver's seat. He adjusted the rearview mirror, his gaze sweeping right past me as if I were a garden gnome, a decorative object in the landscape of his life. He started the engine, the powerful motor rumbling to life, and without a final glance, a wave, or a word, he put the car in gear. The tires spun on the loose gravel, kicking up a plume of dust and grit. I stood frozen, watching the car that held my entire world pull away. I watched it drive down the long palm-lined driveway. I watched it turn onto the main road, its dark form shrinking until it was just a speck in the distance. And then it was gone. The dust settled, coating my yellow sundress and my bare legs in a fine gray film. The world went completely, terrifyingly silent. The only sound was the buzzing of bees in the lavender bushes that lined the drive. They were gone, and the silence they left behind was louder than any shouting I had ever heard. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my 5-year-old mind unable to process the finality of it. I told myself it was a game, a test. If I waited long enough, they would come back. They had to. But the sun began to dip lower, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, the colors of an ending, and the horrible truth began to seep into my bones. This wasn't a game. A sob clawed its way up my throat, a raw, ragged sound. The tears I had been holding back all day finally came, hot and fast. I crumpled to the ground, right there in the middle of the driveway, my body shaking with a grief too big for my small frame. I was crying for them to come back, crying because I didn't understand what I had done to make them leave me. That's when Grandpa Henry found me. I heard the crunch of his expensive leather shoes on the gravel, a steady, solid sound in my chaotic world. His large shadow fell over me, blocking out the last of the cruel, bright sun. He didn't say anything at first. He just knelt down beside me, his old knees popping softly, and wrapped his strong, warm arms around me. He smelled of old books, coffee, and a profound, unwavering safety. He lifted me as if I weighed nothing, holding me tight against the solid wall of his chest. He let me cry until my tears soaked the front of his crisp, white shirt. his big hand stroking my hair in a steady rhythm. He carried me over to the giant oak tree at the edge of the lawn, a tree he said was as old as the state of California itself. He sat down with his back against the rough bark, settling me comfortably in his lap. He waited patiently until my heartbroken sobs subsided into quiet, hiccuping breaths. He pulled a neatly folded handkerchief from his pocket and gently wiped the tear tracks and dust from my cheeks. When I could finally speak, my voice was a tiny, broken whisper. "Why did they leave me, Grandpa?" He was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the empty road. His face, etched with the lines of a long and complicated life, was filled with a deep, weary sadness. When he finally spoke, his voice was a low, comforting rumble. "Sometimes people get lost, Hallie," he said softly. "They get so busy chasing things they think are important, shiny, loud things, that they forget what truly matters. They forget what is real and what is hollow." He hugged me tighter, his arms a fortress around me. "But that is their mistake. It is about the emptiness inside of them, not about any failing in you. It is not, and it will never be your fault. Do you understand me?" I nodded weakly, burying my face in his shirt. He looked down at me then, his eyes the color of a stormy sea, clear and direct and full of a fierce love that would become my anchor. "You'll never have to chase love again, sweetheart," he promised, his voice low and firm, sealing a pact between us. "Not as long as I'm here." He kept that promise. Every single day for the next 24 years until the day he died. He was the only one who did. In the vast, echoing silence my parents left behind, Henry Whitmore became my entire world. He was not just a substitute. He was the foundation. He was the steady hand that held mine, the calm voice that guided me, the unshakable presence that taught me I was not abandoned, but chosen. He had built a global shipping empire from a single rusty freighter and a will of iron, yet he poured that same formidable energy into raising one small, heartbroken girl. Our life together was built on a foundation of routine and quiet love. He believed that discipline was a form of caring, that structure could heal the chaos of a wounded heart. Our days began at 6 o'clock sharp. There was no alarm clock in my room. His gentle but firm knock on my door was all that was needed. "The world doesn't wait for the lazy kiddo," he'd say, his voice still gravelly with sleep. By the time I was downstairs, he would be at the massive oak breakfast table, already halfway through the Wall Street Journal, with a second newspaper, the local Santa Barbara paper, waiting for me at my place. These were not idle mornings. They were lessons. As I grew older, he moved on from asking me to read the comics to discussing the headlines. "See this merger?" he'd ask, tapping an article. "The papers are calling it a partnership. But look at the stock valuation. It's a takeover. They're just using polite language. What are they not saying?" That question became the bedrock of my education. What are they not saying? He taught me to look for the story behind the story, the motive hidden between the lines, the truth buried beneath the polished surface of a press release. He was teaching me to navigate a world he knew was often built on deception. When I was 12, I came home from school upset. A group of girls had started a rumor about me, something petty and cruel. I was crying in my room when he came in. He didn't offer empty platitudes like, "They're just jealous." He sat on the edge of my bed and looked at me seriously. "Truth is your shield, Hallie," he said. "It feels heavy at first and it's not flashy, but lies are made of glass. They're shiny and they can cut, but they shatter under pressure. Your truth is made of steel. Stand behind it and let them throw their rocks. They will be the only ones who get hurt." The next day at school, when the girls confronted me, I just looked them in the eye and said, calmly and quietly, "That's not true." I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I just stood there, behind my steel shield, and they eventually faltered, their lies shattering against my silence. It was a lesson I never forgot. He applied this philosophy to everything. He taught me about business not through textbooks, but through experience. By the time I was in high school, he'd bring home redacted contracts from Whitmore Shipping. We'd spread them out on the dining room table after dinner, and he'd walk me through them, line by line. "Look here," he'd say, pointing to a clause buried deep in the document. "This force majeure clause is too broad. It gives them an out for almost anything. A good contract protects both sides. A bad one sets a trap." He was giving me an MBA at the dinner table, arming me with a knowledge of the world that was practical and invaluable. But his most important lessons had nothing to do with money or business. He taught me the things a father should. He taught me how to change a tire on my first car, his big, capable hands guiding mine as he explained the importance of lug nuts and leverage. He taught me how to sail, how to read the wind and the tides, showing me how to respect the power of the ocean but never to fear it. He taught me how to make his mother's lasagna, the recipe a sacred handwritten document he kept in his desk drawer. These moments of simple, shared activity were where his love was most apparent. He was present. He was always, completely, present. The ghosts of my parents lingered at the edges of our life, making their presence known through sterile, performative gestures. Every year on my birthday, a package would arrive from a high-end store delivered by a courier. It was always something expensive and wildly impersonal. A designer handbag when I was 14, a diamond tennis bracelet when I was 17, a cashmere sweater in a color I never wore. There was never a handwritten note, just a small, pre-printed card that read, "Happy birthday, love, Mom and Dad." I remember my 16th birthday clearly. A small velvet box arrived. Inside was a delicate, expensive diamond necklace. It was beautiful, but holding it felt like holding a piece of ice. It had no warmth, no meaning. I showed it to Grandpa Henry, my disappointment a heavy weight in my chest. He looked at the necklace, then at me. "Does this make you feel loved, Hallie?" he asked gently. Tears welled in my eyes as I shook my head. "No," I whispered. "It just makes me feel like an obligation they remembered to pay." He nodded slowly, his expression full of understanding. "Then let's turn their empty gesture into something meaningful," he said. The next day, we went to a reputable jeweler and sold the necklace. He let me choose the charity, and I donated the entire amount to a local shelter for runaway teens. It was a quiet act of defiance, a way of taking their hollow currency and converting it into something real. We did it every year after that. He rarely spoke of his son, my father. The pain was too deep, a wound that had never properly healed. But one rainy afternoon, I found an old photo album in his study. In it was a picture of a much younger Grandpa Henry, his arm around a teenage boy with my father's face and a genuine, happy smile. "He used to love the sea," Grandpa said, his voice soft, coming from behind me. "We'd spend every weekend on the boat. He was a good sailor." He traced the outline of my father's face with his finger. Then he met Victoria. She convinced him the ocean was for the working class. She wanted yachts and cocktail parties. She wanted a different life, and he chose to want it too. There was no anger in his voice, only a profound, bottomless sorrow. He lost his way, Hallie. He stopped being my son long before he stopped being your father. When he was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, he faced it with the same quiet stoicism he faced everything else. He refused chemotherapy. "I've lived my life on my own terms," he told me, "and I intend to leave it the same way." I moved back home from San Francisco, where I'd been working in finance, and became his caregiver. Our roles reversed. I was the one making him meals, ensuring he took his medication, reading to him in his study when his eyes grew too tired. We spent his final months in that book-lined room, surrounded by the stories of the world, creating our own final chapter. The day before he died, his breath was shallow, his voice a threadbare whisper, but his mind was as sharp as ever. He clutched my hand, his grip surprisingly strong. "They will come back, Hallie," he said, his eyes locking onto mine, demanding my full attention. "When the money is on the table, the vultures always circle. They will come with their smiles and their lawyers." He paused, taking a ragged breath. "Don't let them poison my memory. Don't let them rewrite our story. What we had, it was real. Don't let them tell you otherwise." "I won't, Grandpa," I whispered, tears streaming down my face, my heart breaking. "I promise." "Good girl," he breathed, a faint smile touching his lips. "Remember what I taught you. Stand still in the storm. Let them show the world who they are." Those were his last true words to me. He passed away the next morning, leaving me armed with his lessons, his love, and his final prophetic warning. He had not just raised me, he had prepared me. The funeral was a grand, somber affair, precisely the kind of event Grandpa Henry would have found unnecessarily ostentatious. The old stone church in Santa Barbara was filled to capacity, its pews overflowing with the powerful and the influential. The air was thick with the cloying scent of lilies and the hushed, important murmurs of men who measured their lives in stock prices and political favors. They had all come to pay their respects to Henry Whitmore, the titan of industry. As I sat in the front pew, dressed in a simple black dress that felt like a costume, I felt a profound sense of disconnection. They were mourning a legend on the front page of the Wall Street Journal. I was mourning the man who, upon finding out I'd gotten my first C in algebra, didn't scold me, but instead sat down and patiently worked through equations with me for hours until I understood. One by one, men in expensive suits took to the pulpit to deliver polished eulogies about his business acumen, his unwavering integrity, his legendary foresight. A state senator spoke of his generous, anonymous contributions. A shipping magnate from Greece recounted a story of a handshake deal that Henry had honored to his own detriment. Each word was true, but it felt like they were describing a marble statue, cold and perfect and immense. I wanted to scream. But what about the way he hummed off-key when he was concentrating? Or the way he always saved me the corner piece of the brownie pan? Or the worn-out armchair in his study that was molded to the shape of his body? That was the man I had lost. My grief felt intensely private, almost profane, in this public spectacle of remembrance. And then I saw them. They were sitting 4 rows back, on the opposite side of the aisle, as if respecting a border that had been drawn 24 years ago. My parents, Victoria and Charles. I hadn't seen them in person since that hot, dusty afternoon, and the sight of them stole the air from my lungs. They were a portrait of curated grief. My father, Charles, looked distinguished, his silver hair perfectly coiffed, his jaw set in a mask of solemn sorrow. He looked less like a grieving son and more like a man posing for a formal portrait. Beside him, my mother, Victoria, was the picture of tragic elegance. Dressed in a black designer suit with a string of pearls at her throat, she dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief. From my vantage point, I could see that her eyes were completely dry. It was all a performance, and they were seasoned actors. A cold, hard dread coiled in my stomach. Grandpa's final words echoed in my mind with chilling clarity. When the money is on the table, the vultures always circle. They hadn't come to mourn. They had come to stake a claim. Their presence felt like a desecration, a violation of the sacred space of my grief. I tore my eyes away from them and focused on the stained glass window above the altar, trying to breathe, trying to remember his lessons. Stand still. Let them show the world who they are. After the service concluded, we filed out into the bright, unforgiving sunlight of the churchyard. A receiving line formed organically, and I found myself trapped, accepting condolences from people whose faces I barely recognized. Their words were a meaningless blur. So sorry for your loss. He was a great man, a true legend. I just nodded, my face aching from the effort of maintaining a neutral expression. Then, the crowd parted. They were walking toward me, moving with the unearned confidence of people who believe the world owes them something. My mother led the way, a sad, gentle smile fixed on her face. My father followed a pace behind, his expression unreadable. For a moment, we just stood there, a triangle of strangers bound by blood but separated by an ocean of choices. "Hallie," my mother said, her voice a soft, practiced whisper that was designed to sound intimate. "You've grown into such a beautiful young woman." She reached out, as if to tuck a stray strand of hair behind my ear, a gesture of maternal affection she had never earned the right to make. I took a small, involuntary step back, and her hand dropped to her side. The sound of my own name on her lips felt alien. It was a word that belonged to Grandpa Henry, to my friends, to me. In her mouth it sounded hollowed out, a tool she was using to get what she wanted. The anger I had been suppressing, cold and sharp, rose in my throat. "You remembered my name?" I said. My voice was quiet, devoid of inflection, but the words landed with the weight of 2.5 decades of silence. My mother's smile tightened at the edges. A flicker of irritation flashed in her eyes before she masked it. "Of course I did, darling. Don't be dramatic." My father stepped forward then, placing a hand on my mother's elbow in a gesture that was meant to look supportive, but was actually a signal to change tactics. "Your grandfather was a great man, Hallie," he said, his voice the deep, resonant baritone he used in boardrooms. We always regretted how much distance grew between us. The lie was so breathtakingly audacious that I felt a moment of dizzying disbelief. They didn't regret the distance. They had manufactured it. They had packed it in their leather suitcases and driven away with it. They had nurtured it with years of silence and neglect. "We're still family," my mother added, her voice regaining its syrupy, persuasive tone. "And in a difficult time like this, family needs to put aside its differences and come together. Family." The word was a weapon in her mouth. These people, these strangers who shared my DNA but nothing else, were trying to claim that sacred title now that it was attached to a billion-dollar estate. The hypocrisy was a physical thing, something I could taste, bitter and metallic at the back of my throat. I looked at my mother's perfectly made-up face and my father's impassive one, and I knew that if I opened my mouth, a torrent of rage and pain would come pouring out. I would scream at them. I would demand to know how they could have left a 5-year-old child without a backward glance. I would ask if they ever, even for a single moment, wondered if I was okay. But I could hear Grandpa's voice in my head, calm and steady. Let them show the world who they are. A screaming match in a churchyard was what they wanted. It would make me look hysterical, emotional, unstable. It would fit their narrative. So I did the one thing they didn't expect. I said nothing. I gave them nothing. I simply held their gaze for a long, silent moment, letting them see the vast, empty space where a daughter's love and forgiveness might have been. Then I turned my back on them and walked away. I didn't run. I walked, my back straight, my head held high, leaving them standing there amidst the tombstones and the whispers. It wasn't an ending. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that it was just the opening salvo in the war to come. A week after the funeral, the air in the house still felt heavy with absence. Every room seemed too big, too quiet. The appointment for the will reading loomed over me like a gathering storm. It was to be held in Grandpa Henry's office, a room that was the heart of the house, and, for me, the most sacred space on earth. It smelled of old leather, pipe tobacco, a habit he'd given up years ago, but the scent lingered stubbornly, and books. Walking into it felt like a violation, but I knew it was where this had to happen. I arrived a few minutes early, needing a moment to ground myself. I ran my hand over the worn leather of his armchair, my fingers tracing the cracks like a map of the thousands of hours he'd spent there. I looked at the intricate model of the Star of the Pacific, his first freighter, which sat in a glass case by the window. This room wasn't about wealth. It was about a life's work, a legacy of grit and determination. The doorbell chimed, a sharp, unwelcome sound. A moment later, Mr. Briggs, my grandfather's lawyer for over 40 years, escorted my parents and their own lawyer into the office. My parents entered the room as if they were assessing a property they were considering buying. My mother's eyes scanned the antique furniture, the priceless maritime paintings. My father glanced at the portrait of Grandpa Henry over the fireplace with a detached, almost clinical expression. They were not seeing memories. They were seeing assets. They sat down at the large mahogany desk opposite me, arranging themselves with a practiced ease. They were a team, a united front. Their lawyer, a slick man named Donovan with a predatory smile, placed a polished leather briefcase on the desk with a soft, confident thud. "Hallie," my mother began, her voice dripping with false sympathy, "I'm glad we can do this together. I'm sure it's what your grandfather would have wanted." I just looked at her, my silence a wall she couldn't seem to find a foothold on. Mr. Briggs, a small, meticulously dressed man whose kind eyes were currently shadowed with weary resolve, sat behind the desk. He nodded curtly at my parents and their lawyer before putting on his reading glasses. The rustle of the thick parchment paper was the only sound in the room. He cleared his throat. "We are gathered here to read the last will and testament of Henry James Whitmore," he began, his voice formal and steady. He started with the standard legal jargon, a slow, methodical recitation of clauses and subclauses. The minutes stretched on, each one tightening the knot of tension in the room. My father tapped his fingers impatiently on the arm of his chair. My mother kept glancing at me, a strange, pitying little smile on her lips, as if she were about to witness a child's disappointment and was preparing her comforting words. She thought I was about to be given a respectable but minor trust fund, a token to keep me quiet while they inherited the empire. Mr. Briggs paused, taking a slow sip of water. He adjusted his glasses and looked over the rims at my parents. "Now, we come to the primary bequests." He detailed a few smaller items first: a generous donation to the Scripps Institution of Oceanography, lifetime pensions for his long-serving household staff, a small portfolio of stocks for a few old friends. With each minor bequest, my parents' posture grew more relaxed, more confident. This was all just the opening act. Then Mr. Briggs turned a page. The rustle of the paper seemed to echo in the silent room. He took a breath. "Regarding the remainder of my estate," he read, his voice gaining a new weight, a new clarity, "including all controlling shares and holdings in Whitmore Shipping, all real estate properties, both domestic and international, all art and antiquities, and all stocks, bonds, and liquid assets, I, Henry Whitmore, being of sound mind and body, do leave all of it, in its entirety, without condition, to my beloved granddaughter, Hallie Whitmore." Silence. It was not a peaceful silence. It was the dead electric silence of a lightning strike, the moment after the flash and before the thunder. The words seemed to hang in the air, shimmering, impossible. My own breath caught in my throat. I felt a dizzying, light-headed sensation, as if the room had suddenly tilted on its axis. All of it? The entire legacy, the empire he had built with his bare hands. He had placed it in my care. It wasn't a gift of money. It was a gift of monumental trust. My eyes instinctively went to his portrait over the fireplace. His painted eyes seemed to meet mine, steady and sure. My mother's sharp gasp shattered the stillness. "What?" she said, her voice a high, strangled squeak. That can't be right." There must be a mistake. Donovan, their lawyer, leaned forward, his shark smile gone, replaced by a look of disbelief. Mr. Briggs, perhaps you should read that clause again. My father's face had transformed. The calm, entitled composure was gone, replaced by a dark, mottled flush of crimson. This is an outrage, he snarled, his voice a low growl. He was a sick old man. She was living here, whispering in his ear for 2 years. This is a clear case of undue influence. Mr. Briggs remained utterly composed. He held up a hand to forestall any further outbursts. I can assure you the will is legally sound and was validated by Mr. Whitmore with his personal physician and a psychiatric specialist present just 6 months ago. He then turned to the final page. There is one final addendum. It is a personal note. He looked directly, unflinchingly at my parents. He read the words slowly, each one a hammer blow. And to my son, Charles, and my daughter-in-law, Victoria, I leave this note. Those who walk away from truth for comfort have already forfeited their inheritance. You made your choice 24 years ago when you drove down that driveway. You chose a life of surfaces, of appearances, of empty glamour. I am leaving my life's work to the only person who ever understood its true value. Now you must live with your choice. The judgment was absolute. It was not just a disinheritance. It was a condemnation. My mother's face, which I had only ever seen in a state of perfect, icy control, completely unraveled. The mask of the grieving socialite shattered, and for the first time, I saw the raw, ugly thing that lived underneath. Her face contorted with a rage so pure it was terrifying. He was a bitter old fool, she shrieked, her voice shrill and ugly. And you, she said, her venomous gaze turning on me. You are a manipulative little snake. You poisoned him against his own family. This will not stand, my father said, his voice shaking with fury as he stood up, knocking his chair back slightly. We will contest this. We will drag this through every court in the state. You will not see a single dime of that money, I guarantee it. I didn't flinch. I didn't speak. I just sat there, my hands folded calmly on the desk in front of me, and met their rage with the stillness my grandfather had taught me to command. I let their storm break around me. Their threats, their accusations, their ugliness, it was all just noise. They stormed out of the office, their lawyer scrambling to gather his things and follow them, muttering about legal options and filing motions. The door slammed shut behind them, leaving me in the sudden ringing silence. I sat there for a long time, alone in the office with Mr. Briggs. He quietly pushed the bound copy of the will across the desk toward me. My hands were trembling slightly as I reached for it. It felt impossibly heavy. It was the weight of a life's work, of a legacy, of a profound and abiding love. But it was also the weight of the war that had just been declared. I was no longer just Hallie Whitmore, the abandoned girl. In their eyes, I was now the enemy, and I knew, with absolute certainty, that they would stop at nothing to destroy me. The quiet that followed the will reading was deceptive. It was not a silence of peace, but the heavy, charged stillness that precedes a hurricane. I spent the first few days in a daze, walking through the rooms of the house that was now, incomprehensibly, mine. I'd touch the back of Grandpa Henry's armchair, run my fingers over the spines of his books, and try to absorb the sheer, crushing magnitude of his trust in me. The grief was still a raw, physical ache, but now it was threaded with the immense weight of responsibility. He hadn't just left me a fortune. He had left me his life's work, his legacy, his very name, and I had no idea if I was strong enough to carry it. The hurricane made landfall a week later. It didn't arrive with a roar, but with a quiet, sickening thud. It was the sound of a thick, heavy envelope landing on the stone porch. It had been delivered by a courier, a man in a crisp uniform who made me sign for it on a digital screen. There was no return address. Just my name, Hallie Whitmore, typed in a cold, impersonal font. My hands trembled as I opened it. The paper inside was thick, official, and covered in dense legal language that I had to read 3 times to fully comprehend. At the top, in stark, bold letters, it read, Notice of Civil Action in the Superior Court of California, County of Santa Barbara. And then, the names, Charles and Victoria Whitmore, plaintiffs versus Hallie Whitmore, defendant. They were suing me, my own parents. The words swam before my eyes, the legal jargon blurring into an accusation that felt both shocking and utterly inevitable. Claim of undue influence, lack of testamentary capacity, tortious interference with expected inheritance. It was a dictionary of betrayal. They were accusing me, in the cold, formal language of the law, of manipulating a sick, senile old man. They were claiming I had poisoned my grandfather against them, that I had coerced him into rewriting his will for my own greedy benefit. They were systematically turning our story, my entire life with Grandpa Henry, into a crime. I sank into a chair in the entryway, the documents clutched in my hand. A wave of nausea washed over me. This was their next move. Not a phone call, not a letter, not a single attempt to speak to me directly. Just this, an act of war, delivered by a stranger. Grandpa's final warning echoed in my ears. They will come with their smiles and their lawyers. Within 48 hours, the private war went public. Their lawyer, Donovan, was a master of media manipulation. The story broke first on a sleazy financial news blog, then was picked up by the mainstream press. The headlines were brutal, designed to paint me as a villain in a melodrama. Billionaire's estranged daughter, accused of brainwashing elderly father for inheritance. Whitmore empire in turmoil as family cries foul play. The Santa Barbara schemer. How a granddaughter stole $1 billion fortune. My face was suddenly everywhere. A photo they must have pulled from my college alumni page. Smiling and naive. It was plastered next to pictures of my parents looking somber and victimized as they left their lawyer's office. Reporters, like hungry wolves, began to camp outside the estate gates. News vans with large satellite dishes on their roofs parked along the road. The constant presence of their cameras made me a prisoner in my own home. Every time I looked out a window, I saw the glint of a long-range lens. They were waiting for me to crack, to emerge, tear-streaked and hysterical, to give them the image that would prove their narrative. The phone started ringing incessantly. Numbers I didn't recognize. Reporters offering me a chance to tell my side of the story, which I knew was just a trap to twist my words. I stopped answering. I felt besieged, isolated, the world shrinking to the walls of the house. The public narrative was so powerful, so convincing, that I felt my own reality begin to warp. Was this who I was? A greedy, manipulative schemer? For a terrifying moment, their lies felt more real than my truth. That's when I called Robert Hayes. His name was in a sealed envelope Mr. Briggs had given me, marked in case of emergency. Grandpa Henry had pre-selected him years ago. Robert is not a shark, Grandpa's note said. He's a bulldog. He'll find the truth and he won't let go. Robert arrived the next day, slipping past the media circus in a nondescript car. He was the complete opposite of Donovan. He was in his late 50s, with a rumpled suit, kind eyes, and a quiet, reassuring demeanor. He didn't make grand promises. He just sat with me in the study, listened to the whole story without interruption, and carefully read through the lawsuit. When he was done, he looked at me over his glasses. "This is a classic undue influence claim, Hallie," he said, his voice calm and steady. "It's ugly, it's personal, and it's designed to break you down long before you ever see a courtroom. Their strategy isn't to win on the facts. Their strategy is to make the process so painful, so public, and so expensive that you'd rather give them what they want than continue to fight." He paused, his gaze unwavering. "They are counting on fear to silence you. They believe that you, the granddaughter, will not have the stomach to fight them. The parents." I just nodded, the knot in my stomach tightening. "What do we do?" "We do exactly what your grandfather would have done," he replied. "We don't get drawn into their circus. We don't talk to the press. We build our case on the foundation of indisputable truth. We will be methodical, patient, and relentless." The first step was the deposition. It was held in a sterile conference room in Donovan's high-rise office building. My parents were there, sitting beside their lawyer, their faces cold and impassive. It was the first time I'd been in the same room with them since the will reading. They didn't look at me. For 8 solid hours, Donovan questioned me. His voice was smooth and condescending, his questions designed to twist every act of love into an act of manipulation. "Miss Whitmore, isn't it true that you moved back into your grandfather's home as soon as you learned of his diagnosis?" "Yes," I said calmly. "He asked me to. He didn't want to be alone or with strangers. He asked you to, or you suggested it. Did you see a financial opportunity in his illness?" "I saw my grandfather needed me." He moved on. "You handled his finances in his final months, correct? You had access to his bank accounts, his checkbooks?" "I paid his bills for him, yes. The household bills, the nurse's bills. He asked me to." "How convenient," Donovan sneered. "So you had complete control over the finances of a very sick, very vulnerable, very wealthy man. Every question was a trap. Did I talk to him about my parents? Yes, so I was poisoning his mind. Did I help him with his correspondence? Yes, so I was isolating him. Every kindness, every act of care was reframed as a calculated step in a master plan to steal his money. Through it all, I could feel my parents' eyes on me, their cold judgment a palpable force in the room. The hardest part was when Donovan brought up the day they left. "Your grandfather told you that your parents abandoned you, didn't he?" He fostered this narrative of victimhood in you, correct? The rage I felt was a white-hot flash. He was trying to desecrate not just my memory, but Grandpa Henry's love. I took a slow breath, just as Robert had coached me, just as Grandpa had taught me. I looked directly at Donovan. My parents abandoned me, I said, my voice quiet but firm. My grandfather gave me a home. Those are not narratives. They are facts. Donovan's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. I just stated the truth. That night, after the deposition, I felt utterly drained, as if I had been physically beaten. The doubt crept back in. Could I do this? Could I withstand their onslaught? The public shame, the character assassination, the twisting of my most precious memories into weapons against me. Maybe it would be easier to just give them some of the money, to make them go away and leave me in peace. Exhausted, I went into Grandpa's study. I needed to feel close to him. I ran my hand along his bookshelves and my fingers stopped on a row of identical leather-bound journals. They were his personal logs, one for every year. I pulled one out from about 10 years ago and opened it. His familiar, strong handwriting filled the page. I read for hours, losing myself in his thoughts, his observations, his wisdom. And then I found an entry that seemed to be written directly to me, across the years. Today, a competitor tried to force a hostile takeover. They spread lies to the press, tried to spook the shareholders, created a storm of noise and fear. My board was in a panic. They wanted to react, to issue statements, to fight fire with fire. I told them no. I told them to stand still. The truth does not need to scream. A lie is a storm, all wind and fury, but it has no substance. It will blow itself out. The truth is a mountain. It is quiet. It is solid. And it doesn't move. Tears streamed down my face, but they weren't tears of sadness or fear. They were tears of gratitude. He had left me a roadmap. He had prepared me for this exact moment. They were the storm. Their lies, their lawsuit, the media frenzy. It was all wind and fury. All I had to do was be the mountain. I closed the journal and felt a profound sense of calm settle over me. The fear was gone, replaced by a quiet, unshakable resolve. Robert Hayes was right. They were counting on me to break, but they didn't know I was made of the same steel as Henry Whitmore. The day the trial began, the air in Santa Barbara was thick with a marine layer, casting the world in a hazy, gray light that matched my mood. The scene outside the courthouse was a zoo. Reporters swarmed the steps, shouting my name, shoving microphones in my face. Robert Hayes guided me through the chaos, his hand a steady presence on my elbow. "Deep breaths, Hallie," he murmured. "Just focus on the doors. Don't look at them." Inside, the courtroom was a cavern of polished dark wood and cold marble. It was packed to capacity. Every seat was filled with journalists, legal analysts, and morbidly curious members of the public who had come to watch the rich devour their own. The room buzzed with a low, predatory hum. I took my place at the defendant's table and stared straight ahead, focusing on the empty judge's bench. I could feel my parents' presence at the plaintiff's table without having to look. Their confidence was an almost tangible aura, radiating from them like a cold wave. They smiled and whispered to their lawyer, Donovan, putting on a show of wronged but resilient, parents for the jury they hoped to win over, the jury of public opinion. The bailiff's voice boomed, "All rise," and Judge Nolan entered. He was an older man, his face a roadmap of long years on the bench, his eyes tired but sharp. He sat down heavily and opened the case file. His gaze swept over the room, over my parents and their lawyer, and then it landed on me. He froze. He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing slightly as he studied my face. A long, silent moment passed. The buzzing in the room died down as everyone waited. He looked down at the name on the file, then back up at me. It was then that he whispered the question that silenced the entire room. "Wait, you're her?" Before anyone could react, he clarified, his voice still low but now audible to the whole court. He looked directly at me. "You're Henry Whitmore's granddaughter." It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact. "Yes, Your Honor," I managed to say, my voice steady. He nodded once, a slow, deliberate motion. A flicker of memory, of respect crossed his face. "He spoke of you often, Miss Whitmore. He served as my mentor when I was a young lawyer just starting out. He once told me you were made of the same steel he was." His gaze hardened as he looked over at my parents' table. Let's see if he was right. "Proceed, Mr. Donovan." My parents' confident smiles had vanished. Victoria's face was pale with shock, and Charles looked deeply unsettled. Their entire strategy depended on painting me as an unknown, a greedy interloper. But the judge knew my grandfather. The judge knew of me. The ground had just shifted beneath their feet. Donovan recovered quickly, launching into his opening statement. He was a gifted orator, and he painted a masterful, venomous picture. "This is a story of tragedy," he began, his voice filled with pathos as he gestured toward my parents. "A story of two loving parents, Charles and Victoria Whitmore, who were systematically and cruelly cut out of the life of their aging, vulnerable father by a defendant consumed by greed. He portrayed them as victims. Their short trip, 24 years ago, as a painful but necessary business decision that their unforgiving father used against them. He depicted me as a predator, swooping in during my grandfather's illness, a period of weakness and confusion, to prey on his loneliness and manipulate him into giving me everything. It was a brilliant work of fiction. The first witness they called was my mother. She took the stand, the very image of grieving maternal sorrow. She spoke of her deep love for her father-in-law and her heartbreak at being kept away. Donovan led her with gentle, leading questions. "Mrs. Whitmore, did you try to contact your father-in-law over the years?" "Oh, constantly," she said, her voice breaking as she dabbed her eye with a handkerchief. "We sent letters, gifts for Hallie's birthday every single year. But his line was always busy, our letters went unanswered. We felt a wall had been built around him. When it was Robert Hayes' turn to cross-examine, his approach was devastatingly simple. He was calm, polite, and armed with facts. "Mrs. Whitmore," he began, "you say you tried to contact him constantly. In the past 24 years, can you provide the court with your phone records showing these attempted calls?" She faltered. "Well, I don't keep records from that long ago." "I see," Robert said. "We have your grandfather's phone records for the last 10 years. Your phone number does not appear once. Not for a birthday. Not for a holiday. Not even when he was first diagnosed with cancer. Can you explain that?" Victoria flushed. "He made it clear he didn't want to hear from us. So you didn't call because he didn't want you to, not because, as you claimed, a wall had been built?" Robert pressed gently. "Regarding the birthday gifts for Hallie, we have the receipts. They were all purchased by your personal assistant and sent from a corporate account. Did you ever in 24 years pick out a gift for your daughter yourself?" My mother stared at him, her mouth opening and closing like a fish. "I am a very busy woman," Robert nodded. "Indeed. No further questions." He dismantled their narrative piece by piece with cold, hard evidence. He brought in financial records showing that I had not spent a single cent of my grandfather's money on myself, but had used it only for his care and the upkeep of his home. He brought in testimony from Grandpa Henry's doctors, who stated unequivocally that he was of sharp and sound mind until the very end, and that he often spoke of his pride in his granddaughter. Finally, it was my turn to take the stand. My heart hammered against my ribs as I walked to the witness box. The weight of every eye in the room was a physical pressure. Donovan's cross-examination was even more brutal than it had been in the deposition. He tried to paint me as cold, calculating, and unfeeling. He brought up my lack of emotion at the funeral. He tried to twist my quiet strength into a sign of guilt, but I held my ground. I answered his questions simply, directly, and honestly. I didn't give him the emotional outburst he was trying to provoke. When it was Robert's turn, he asked me only a few questions. "Hallie, why do you believe your grandfather left his estate to you?" Donovan jumped up. "Objection! Calls for speculation." "Overruled," Judge Nolan said, his eyes fixed on me. "The witness will answer." I took a deep breath. He left it to me because he trusted me. He trusted me to protect his life's work. He knew I understood that his company wasn't just about money. It was about integrity. It was about keeping your word. He knew I would honor that. "And what about your parents?" Robert asked gently. I looked over at them for the first time. My mother was glaring at me with pure hatred. My father, he wouldn't meet my eyes. He was staring down at his hands. "My grandfather loved his son," I said, my voice clear and steady. But he was deeply disappointed in the man he became. He saw people who valued image over substance, wealth over worth. Then Robert pulled out the leather-bound journal Grandpa had given me, the one I had kept since I was 16. "Your Honor, I would like to enter into evidence a journal given to the defendant by Mr. Whitmore." Donovan objected again. "Hearsay. It speaks to the decedent's state of mind and his relationship with the defendant," Judge Nolan ruled. "I'll allow it." Robert handed me the journal. "Hallie, could you please read the final entry your grandfather wrote in this journal on your 18th birthday?" My hands were shaking as I opened the book to the last page. His handwriting, so familiar, so beloved, filled the page. I read the words aloud, my voice echoing in the silent courtroom. "My dearest Hallie, today you are a woman. The world will now expect you to make your own way, but I know you have been doing that since you were 5 years old. I watch you and I see the best parts of me, but with a kindness and a resilience that is all your own. Your parents chose a path of glittering emptiness. I pray they find their way back someday, but I cannot stake my legacy on a prayer. You are not my backup plan, Hallie. You were always the plan. You are my true north. You are my legacy. I finished reading, my voice thick with emotion. I looked up at the judge. His eyes were glistening. I looked at my parents. My mother looked apoplectic with rage. But my father, a single tear was tracing a path down his cheek. I looked back at the judge. My grandfather didn't change his will out of manipulation or confusion, I said, my voice finding its strength again. He changed it because he finally stopped hoping my parents would ever change. He made a choice. He chose the truth. The room was completely still. The truth, Grandpa Henry's truth, had finally taken the stand. The 3 days between the end of the trial and the judge's verdict were the longest of my life. The house, which had been a sanctuary, suddenly felt like a cage again. The media frenzy had reached a fever pitch. Legal analysts on every news channel debated the case, most of them siding with the narrative of the poor, abandoned parents. They called me cold, unflappable, and calculating. They mistook my composure for a lack of feeling, my refusal to cry on the stand as a sign of a hardened heart. The court of public opinion had largely found me guilty. I avoided it all. I turned off the television, silenced my phone, and tried to lose myself in my grandfather's world. I sat in his study for hours, not reading his journals this time, but looking through his old business ledgers from the 1950s. I traced the path of his company from a single scrappy freighter to a global powerhouse. It was all there in the numbers, the risks he took, the lean years, the breakthrough contracts. It was the story of his life, written in ink and ambition. It grounded me. This was what I was fighting for. Not the money, but the story. The legacy of a man who built something real and lasting. Robert called on the morning of the third day. "The judge is ready," he said simply. His clerk just called. "Be there at 2 p.m. Walking back into that courthouse felt surreal. The crowd of reporters was even larger than before. A frantic, jostling sea of cameras and microphones. This time, I didn't feel as intimidated. I felt a strange sense of calm. I had told the truth. I had honored my grandfather. The outcome was now out of my hands. I had been the mountain and the storm had raged around me. Now, all that was left was to see what remained standing. The courtroom was electric with anticipation. Every seat was taken. My parents were already at their table. They looked tense but confident. Victoria gave me a thin, triumphant smile as I sat down. They truly believed they had won. They believed their performance of victimhood had been more convincing than my quiet recitation of the facts. Judge Nolan entered, and a deep hush fell over the room. He didn't waste any time. He sat, put on his glasses, and looked down at the papers in front of him. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity. I could hear my own heartbeat, a slow, steady drum in my ears. "I have reviewed all the testimony and evidence presented in the case of Whitmore versus Whitmore," he began, his voice devoid of emotion. He started by methodically dismantling the plaintiff's case. He addressed each of their claims one by one, his words precise and devastating. The claim of undue influence requires evidence that the defendant actively manipulated the testator and substituted her own will for his. The plaintiffs have failed to provide a single piece of credible evidence to support this. Instead, the evidence points to a testator, Mr. Henry Whitmore, who was in full command of his faculties and was deeply, and for good reason, disappointed in his son and daughter-in-law. He looked up, his gaze sweeping over my parents. The claim of isolation is frankly absurd. The plaintiffs admit to a 24-year period of voluntary estrangement. One cannot claim to be isolated by a door that they themselves closed and locked from the outside. The evidence of unanswered phone calls and unreturned letters is non-existent, because the calls were never made, and the letters were never sent. My mother's face had gone rigid, the color draining from her cheeks. My father seemed to shrink in his chair, his gaze fixed on the polished surface of the table in front of him. Judge Nolan continued, his voice gaining a quiet power. "What the evidence does show is a profound, loving, and supportive relationship between a grandfather and the granddaughter he raised in the absence of her parents. It shows a man who spent more than 2 decades imparting his wisdom, his values, and his integrity to his chosen heir. The final will and testament is not the product of manipulation. It is the logical, rational, and heartfelt culmination of that relationship." He paused, taking off his glasses and looking directly at me, then at my parents. His voice softened, but it carried the weight of a final, unassailable truth. There seems to be a belief in this case that familial bonds, that blood, automatically entitles one to an inheritance. It does not. An inheritance is a gift, and a gift is predicated on a relationship. The plaintiffs in this case abandoned that relationship. Miss Whitmore honored it. He looked at the whole courtroom. Justice does not side with blood. It sides with truth. He picked up his gavel. Therefore, it is the decision of this court that the plaintiffs have failed to provide any evidence to support their claims. The will of Henry Whitmore, dated October 14th of last year, is hereby validated and stands as written. The estate belongs to Miss Hallie Whitmore. This case is dismissed. The gavel struck the wood block once. The sound was clean, final, and absolute. For a split second, there was a stunned silence. Then the room erupted. Reporters scrambled for the doors, shouting into their phones. Camera shutters clicked frantically. Donovan was trying to say something to my parents, but they weren't listening. Victoria shot to her feet, her face a mask of pure, ugly fury. "This is a travesty," she shrieked, her voice cracking. She pointed a trembling finger at me. "You will regret this for the rest of your life." Court officers quickly moved to escort her out. My father didn't move. He just sat there looking utterly broken, like a building whose foundations had crumbled. He finally lifted his head and his eyes met mine across the room. There was no anger in them, only a vast, hollow emptiness. Then he stood, turned, and walked out of the courtroom, a defeated man. I didn't move either. Robert Hayes put a hand on my shoulder. "We won, Hallie," but it didn't feel like winning. There was no surge of triumph, no sweet taste of victory. There was only a profound, bone-deep wave of relief and a crushing, overwhelming exhaustion. I had survived. That was all. I had survived the storm, but the landscape was littered with the wreckage of what was supposed to have been my family. There were no winners here. We had all lost something long before we ever set foot in this courtroom. Robert shielded me as we made our way through the media scrum. I didn't say a word. I just kept my eyes fixed on the doors, the same way I had when I entered. When we finally broke free into the gray afternoon, I took my first real breath. It wasn't a breath of celebration. It was the ragged, painful breath of a survivor who had finally reached shore. In the weeks that followed the verdict, a fragile peace began to settle over my life. The news vans and reporters gradually disappeared from the gates, moving on to the next scandal, the next drama. The quiet that returned to the house was no longer heavy with dread, but filled with the possibility of a future. The silence was mine now. The weight of my new responsibilities was immense. I started spending my days at the Whitmore shipping headquarters downtown, a sleek glass tower overlooking the harbor. It was daunting. The board of directors was composed of men who had known my grandfather for decades, and I could feel their skepticism. They saw a 29-year-old girl who had inherited an empire. They were waiting for me to fail. But Grandpa Henry hadn't just left me his money. He had left me his education. I spent my days in meetings and my nights in his study, poring over contracts, market analyses, and logistics reports. I used the lessons he had taught me at the breakfast table. I questioned everything. I read the fine print. I listened more than I spoke. Slowly, cautiously, I began to earn their respect. I wasn't trying to be him. I was trying to be the leader he had trained me to be. I was a mountain, standing still, showing them my substance. Life fell into a new routine, one of work and quiet evenings at home. The pain of the trial began to feel more like a scar than an open wound, a permanent part of me, but no longer bleeding. I thought the story was over. I believed the final chapter had been written in that courtroom. Then, one Tuesday evening, my phone rang. I was in the study, a cup of tea growing cold beside me as I reviewed a fuel cost projection report. The number on the screen was blocked, listed only as unknown. My first instinct, a reflex born from months of media harassment, was to decline the call. My thumb hovered over the red button, but something made me hesitate. A strange, quiet intuition. I answered, "Hello?" There was a pause on the other end, just the faint sound of breathing. I almost hung up, thinking it was a wrong number. Then, a voice spoke my name, Hallie. I froze. The voice was instantly recognizable, yet completely different. All the power, the authority, the booming confidence I associated with my father was gone. This voice was hesitant, gravelly, and stripped bare. It was the voice of a stranger. I said nothing. I couldn't. 1,000 emotions swirled inside me. Anger, suspicion, and a deep, weary sadness. I just waited, my knuckles white as I gripped the phone. He seemed to take my silence as permission to continue. I don't know what to say," he stammered. He took a shaky breath. After the trial, Robert Hayes allowed me to retrieve some of my father's personal effects. Things from before I left. In one of the boxes were his other journals. The ones from my childhood, the ones from the last 20 years. He paused again, and I could hear the emotion thickening his voice. "I've spent the last month reading them, Hallie. All of them. I read about how proud he was when I won my first sailing race. I read about how worried he was when I went off to college. And then I read about his disappointment. I read the entries where he described how I changed after I met your mother, how I started caring more about country clubs and stock options than about him, about the company, about anything real. His voice broke. It was a raw, ragged sound that stunned me into continued silence. He wrote about you every single day, Hallie. Every day. He wrote about teaching you to read, about your first day of school, about how you had his eyes but a kinder heart. And he wrote about the pain. He wrote that losing his son was the great tragedy of his life. He was openly weeping now, not the performative tears of the courtroom, but the gut-wrenching sobs of a man whose heart was broken. I read his journal, he whispered, his voice cracking. He wrote that I lost my way, that I stopped being his son long before I lost his love. He never stopped loving me, Hallie. He just stopped respecting me. I never understood that until now. I finally found my voice, but it was just a quiet whisper. Why are you telling me this? Because I needed you to know, he said, his voice desperate. The things Victoria said, the things Donovan argued in court, they were all lies. We weren't the victims. We were the ones who left. I left. I chose a life that was shiny and empty, and I threw away everything that ever mattered. My father, my daughter. He took another shaky breath. I don't deserve forgiveness. I know that. God, I know that. But I needed you to know that I am so sorry. For everything. The anger I thought I would always feel for him was gone. The trial had burned it out of me. In its place was just a vast, profound emptiness. The ghost of a love that had never been allowed to exist. Forgiveness felt like a foreign concept. A language I didn't speak. It was too simple a word for the lifetime of damage that had been done. I don't know if I can forgive you, I said quietly, the words tasting of a truth that was both harsh and necessary. It's not a switch I can flip. Maybe I never can. I paused, feeling the weight of the years between us. But I'll try, he exhaled, a long, shaky sound of relief. It sounded like he hadn't truly breathed in weeks. That's more than I deserve, he whispered. Thank you, Hallie. He told me he had left my mother. He said the trial had shattered the illusion they had so carefully constructed. He was living in a small apartment, trying to figure out who he was without the money and the status. He didn't ask me for anything. He didn't ask for a second chance. He just wanted me to know the truth from his own lips. When the call ended, I sat in the silent study for a long time, the phone still in my hand. It wasn't closure. The wounds were too deep for that, but it was a beginning. It was the first honest conversation I had ever had with my father. He had finally stopped running from the truth. He had let it catch him, and in doing so, he had given me something I never knew I needed, the acknowledgement that I hadn't been imagining at all. The loss, the pain, the abandonment, it was all real, and it was not my fault. That night I couldn't sleep. The conversation with my father echoed in my mind. I wrapped myself in one of Grandpa Henry's old cashmere sweaters and walked outside into the cool, salt-laced air. I found myself drawn to the rose garden he had planted for my grandmother decades ago, a place he always called the soul of the house. The moon was full, casting a silvery glow on the meticulously kept blooms. The ocean shimmered in the distance below the cliffs, its surface calm and vast. The sound of the waves a gentle, rhythmic whisper. For the first time since Grandpa died, the world felt still. The storm had passed. I opened his personal journal, the one he had written in during his final year. The one Mr. Briggs had given me after the trial. I turned to the very last page. His handwriting was faded and slightly shaky, but the strength of his spirit was still there in every loop and line. The last thing he ever wrote wasn't about business or money. It was about me. True justice isn't found in courtrooms or lawyers' briefs. It's found in the hearts that still believe in it, even when the world tells them not to. I have left Hallie a great deal of money, but I fear it will be more of a burden than a gift. My real legacy, my true inheritance, is the hope that she will carry our truth forward, that she will live a life of substance, not of surfaces. That is a fortune they can never sue for, and a victory they can never take away. A tear slipped down my cheek, then another. They weren't tears of grief or anger. They were tears of release. I looked out at the moonlit ocean and smiled through them. I believe, Grandpa, I whispered into the quiet night. I believe, and for the first time, I felt his presence not as a painful absence, but as a steady, quiet strength inside of me. He was there in the disciplined way I approached my work, in the calm I held onto during the storm, in the simple, profound belief that truth, in the end, is all that matters. My parents stole my childhood. They tried to steal my name, my reputation, and my grandfather's legacy. But they couldn't steal my conscience. They couldn't take the lessons he had so carefully etched onto my soul. That was the real inheritance. That was the fortune that could never be lost. If you've ever had to fight for your truth, if you've ever been made to feel small or invisible by the people who were supposed to love you most, don't give up. Stand still in the storm. Let them show the world who they are. Because one day, when they least expect it, your truth will walk into the room and it won't need an introduction.